Hello, Dan Alasso with History for Today once again, and this will be my reaction to the first chapter of Howard Zinn's book, A People's History of the United States. And the first chapter is titled Columbus, the Indians, and Human Progress. So Zinn begins the very first paragraph with the Arawak, or the Taino people, swimming out to get a closer look at Columbus's ships. So the first image of A People's History is this imagined scene of, as Zinn describes it, Arawak men and women, naked, tawny, and full of wonder. The nakedness is apparently accurate, but it also symbolizes the innocence of these people who, in Columbus's words, willingly traded everything they owned. Although Columbus was impressed by this and by the natives' apparent health and their ignorance of iron weapons, the immediate conclusion that Zinn shows him jumping to, based on this first impression, is they would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. Also on the very first page, Zinn describes Spain, which had financed Columbus's journey, as an extremely unequal society, where he says the population, mostly poor peasants, worked for the nobility, where 2% of the population owned 95% of the land. Anthony Arnove had mentioned in his introduction that I talked about recently that Zinn had talked about the 99% and the 1% decades before the Occupy movement made that idea mainstream. So here's an early example of that theme. Zinn says Columbus would never have made it to Asia, explaining that the mariner had misjudged the size of the planet. And this is probably accurate, but it misses what I think is a very interesting element of this story. The ancient Greeks had estimated the size of the globe pretty darn accurately. So why did Columbus get it wrong? It seems likely that his mistake was based on knowledge that other mariners, the Norse, the Basque, and the Portuguese that Columbus had sailed with extensively on the Atlantic coast of Africa, had all been to the Grand Banks to fish cod and had salted and dried their catches on racks on nearby beaches. So Columbus would have had pretty accurate information, talking to any of these Portuguese fishermen, how long it would take to reach this new land. He incorrectly assumed that this journey would take him to the eastern edge of Asia. But this error, if anything, suggests that he was thinking empirically, adjusting his expectations based on new data. He just didn't have all the data that he would have needed for a correct conclusion. Zinn then goes on to mention the 39 sailors that Columbus left in La Navidad when the Santa Maria ran aground in December 1492. He says that they were given instructions to find gold and that they had likely been killed by the Indians, in Zinn's words, after they had roamed the island in gangs looking for gold, taking women and children as slaves for sex and labor. This is completely credible, but still I wish he would have cited a source for this detail. Similarly, the next element of the story has Columbus, on his return in 1895, rounding up 1,500 native men, women, and children, and then trying to ship the 500 best specimens back to Spain as slaves. In a preview of the Atlantic African slave trade, 200 of these natives die on the passage back to Spain. When the captives arrived, they were put on sale by the deacon of the town, who Zinn says remarked on their lack of embarrassment over their nakedness. If there was a passage available to quote, then there must have been a name. And I would have really liked to have known which Spanish town that was specifically and who that deacon might have been. In another scene, which is reminiscent of the treatment of African rubber harvesters in the Belgian Congo, Zinn says that all of the Indians above the age of 14 were given a quota of gold that they were required to deliver to the Spanish after 3 months. And those who failed had their hands cut off and bled to death. When Indians fled, they were hunted down by the Spanish using dogs and were killed. Zinn also says that native mothers often killed their babies to save them from the Spaniards. and that there were mass suicides using poison derived from cassava. In 2 years, half of the natives had died. By 1650, there were no Arawak at all left on Hispaniola. Now, I don't consider any of these details too incredible to be true. What concerns me is that on the next page, Zinn says, the chief source, and on many matters the only source of information on the first years of the Spanish conquest in the Caribbean, was Bartolome De Las Casas and his book, History of the Indies. Las Casas was a young priest who had participated in the conquest and had witnessed atrocities firsthand. The fact that after a crisis of conscience, he renounced his encomienda that he was granted and wrote against the Spanish treatment of the natives buys him a lot of credibility. But even that doesn't mean that Las Casas was infallible. One of the major issues that I think both Las Casas and Zinn underreport is the effect of disease on the native populations. Las Casas, of course, lived in an era before people understood how disease spreads. And Zinn wrote a people's history just a couple of years after Alfred Crosby published the Columbian Exchange. So it was not yet a mainstream, fully accepted element of the story of colonial America. Now, I don't say this at all to discount the Spanish atrocities in the New World. When Las Casas says, 2 of these so-called Christians met 2 Indian boys one day, each carrying a parrot. They took the parrots and for fun beheaded the boys, I believe him. On the other hand, when he says, while I was in Cuba, 7,000 children died in 3 months, I don't want to jump to the conclusion, as he might have, that these deaths were all due to either Spanish murder or native murder-suicide. It's very likely that most of these deaths were from the waves of European diseases that swept one after another through a population with no inherited immunity or resistance to the viruses and bacteria that the invaders had brought. However, these are really details that I'm quibbling over. On the whole, I agree with Zinn, especially on the other main point that he's trying to make in this first chapter. The story of quote-unquote human progress tends to either minimize or ignore altogether the costs of that progress, especially when those costs are borne by people who aren't the focus of the main narrative. Zinn says, when we read the history books given to children in the United States, it all starts with heroic adventure. There is no bloodshed, and Columbus Day is a celebration. And even in the writing of professional historians for adult audiences, where these issues might be more thoroughly discussed, they generally aren't. Zinn quotes Samuel Eliot Morrison's multi-volume biography of Columbus. Morrison admits that Columbus began what Morrison calls a complete genocide. But as Zinn said, that is one page buried halfway into the telling of a grand romance. And Zinn goes on to explain, there are several ways that a historian can deal with inconvenient truths. One can lie outright about the past, or one can omit facts that might lead to unacceptable conclusions, he says. Zinn gives Morrison credit for doing neither of these, which he says both tend to arouse the reader to rebel against the writer. But he says that Morrison does something nearly as troubling. He mentions the truth quickly and goes on to other things more important to him. Like map making, Zinn explains, writing history involves simplifying a very complex picture into something that the reader can comprehend. However, the historian's simplifications involve decisions about what elements of the past are important. The histories resulting from these ideological choices, Zinn says, are released into a world of contending interests where any chosen emphasis supports, whether the historian means to or not, some kind of interest, whether economic or political or racial or national or sexual. And then mentioning some more recent horrors, Zinn explains, one of the reasons these atrocities are still with us is that we have learned to bury them in a mass of other facts. His mission in this book, he implies, is to unbury them. He says, the history of any country, presented as the history of a family, conceals fierce conflicts of interest, sometimes exploding, most often repressed, between conquerors and conquered, masters and slaves, capitalists and workers, dominators and the dominated in race and sex. And in such a world of conflict, a world of victims and executioners, it is the job of thinking people, as Albert Camus suggested, not to be on the side of the executioners. The result, Zinn warns the reader up front, is a book that, he says, will be skeptical of governments and their attempts through politics and culture to ensnare ordinary people in a giant web of nationhood, pretending to a common interest. Even if people's resistance ultimately failed, he said, history should uncover what he calls those hidden episodes of the past, when, even if in brief flashes, people showed their ability to resist, to join together, occasionally to win. I am supposing, he continues, or perhaps only hoping, that our future may be found in the past's fugitive moments of compassion, rather than its solid centuries of warfare. After this explanation, Zinn returns to the story of first Spanish and then English atrocities against the Indians. In 1585, he says, Richard Grenville sacked and burned a native village in what would later become Virginia. Funny how we never hear about that event in U.S. history textbooks, or how it might have predisposed the natives to respond to the Roanoke settlers a few years later, or the Jamestown settlers a generation later. In this later section of the chapter, Zinn does cite and quote a number of primary sources and other historians, including Chief Powhatan, John Winthrop, Cotton Mather, Roger Williams, and then the historians Edmund Morgan, Virgil Vogel, Hans Koning, Gary Nash, and John Collier. He discusses a probable total native population of about 75 million people, a third of the people possibly living in North America before European contact. He mentions that the natives figured out how to grow maize, corn. I prefer to use the word invented, since they did breed maize out of the local grass teosinte thousands of years ago, about the same time that Asians were developing rice and Mesopotamians were cultivating wheat. Zinn also returns to the idea of social inequality, emphasizing that imperialism was an elite project, and all the gold and silver stolen and shipped to Spain did not make the Spanish people richer. He's quoting Hans Koning there. Against this European social hierarchy, he paints a picture of what a 17th century Jesuit had described as native kindness, humanity, and courtesy that causes them to possess hardly anything except in common. He describes the much higher status of women in native cultures than in European culture. And he says that in spite of priding themselves on the autonomous individual, Indians had a well-developed sense of social responsibility and maintained a strict sense of right and wrong. And here he's quoting Gary Nash. Zinn concludes by emphasizing that Columbus and the Europeans who followed him did not discover an empty wilderness, but invaded continents that were as densely populated as Europe had been. The people who lived here were different, but their cultures were complex, and in many cases, as Zinn says, human relations were more egalitarian than in Europe. Although he admits the danger of over-romanticizing the pre-Columbian native world, Zinn challenges our right to use what he calls the excuse of progress in the annihilation of races. So I thought this was a pretty effective introduction to the topic of the book, showing some of the types of details that Zinn is going to stress in this bottom-up narrative, instead of those top-down ideas that tend to make us think we're all part of one big happy family. And I think he also included a good explanation of why he's doing it. So I'll return with a look at the second chapter, but that is all for today. So I hope people found this a little bit interesting. Thanks very much for listening, and I will see you again